Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation. And today we will present a rapid response webinar exploring President Biden's recently released FY24 budget proposal. And I am joined virtually by who else? But Jeff Davis, senior fellow at the ENO Center for Transportation and editor of ENO Transportation Weekly. ENO Transportation Weekly, for those of you who don't know, is the go-to source of information, analysis, and perspectives on all things transportation, and no one follows it all better than Jeff. So over the course of the next half hour or so, Jeff is going to describe the overall budget picture. He's going to dig into some of the specifics about the United States Department of Transportation, those elements that are contained in the draft budget, and he's going to break all that down by mode and then talk about other implications, such as the possibility of a year-long continuing resolution. So we will take questions at the end, so you can use the Q&A function on the webinar website. You don't have to wait until the end to submit questions. We'll take those as we go throughout. So thank you all for joining us here today. With that, we turn it over to Jeff Davis.
Thank you very much, Rob. I got to say, I miss the old days when us press guys would get to go line up outside the GPO building on North Capitol at 9 a.m. on budget day and get a stack of books about a foot thick and rush to the office and read through them before they went online at 1 in the afternoon. Now everything is evenly online. The president released the sort of 140-page budget for dummies summary last Thursday, and everything else waited until yesterday midday to go online. And now we're finally getting to see a bit of a piece of it. But and for those of you, we're using a new webinar technology today. We just signed a contract with them on Friday, and now, 2 business days later, actually using it. And I think you can adjust in your browser the size of the presentation window if you want, because there are some charts and graphs and tables and things you might want to look at that are larger. So the fiscal 2024 budget request, yours truly, pre-COVID headshot. Part one, briefly, just the big picture. This budget proposes $6.9 trillion in spending versus $5 trillion in estimated tax receipts under current law. So it's a $1.846 trillion deficit, $470 billion larger than FY22. $3.1 trillion in tax increases proposed over 10 years, which Congress will ignore completely. No appetite for that really on either side. So long term, that's a bit padding, misleading. Under this budget, the debt would break 100% of GDP in 2030. That's public debt held by the public exclusive of financial assets. So it excludes Social Security Trust Fund and that kind of thing, and excludes the face value of loans the government owes to students, TIFIA loans, things like that. And it was 70% in FY19, the pre-COVID year. So we've gone from 70% to 93.5% in one disease, and that printing $5 trillion of COVID money, and then it's going to exceed 100% in 2030 under this budget. In terms of infrastructure, and by infrastructure, I'm using the OMB definition, which is called, quote, major public physical capital investment, non-defense category. That's the best you can come to infrastructure spending across all modes, officially measured by OMB. That's gone from $115 billion in 2018 to an estimated $214 billion in 2024. That's almost $100 billion increase in 5 years. And because these are outlays measured, that 213.7 number, that's really independent of any of whether Biden gets his budget through or not, because that's almost entirely liquidating obligations made in 2023 and previous years, because these are slow spending capital programs. So again, $100 billion a year extra in infrastructure on the street from, compared to 2018, that's serious business. That's mostly IIJA right there. The big number everyone fights about is you take all the entitlements aside, all the taxes aside, just by the annual appropriations, the discretionary stuff, and set defense aside, because all of our transportation things, except for a couple of MERAD accounts, are fighting for the non-transportation pie here. So in 2023, the enacted total, using OMB scoring and taking the gimmicks aside and taking veterans' health out of there, because that goes off the top, was $660 billion. And of that, the DOT bill was 28.4 of 660. That was last year. The president's budget request is at least $719 billion opposed to 660. And it's probably more than that once we keep finding gimmicks that are not going to happen and removing them. And House Republicans are looking at a number around, I don't know, $500 billion. They won't say yet, but they did say that in January they want to go back to the FY22 defense plus non-defense total, and they probably freeze defense at the 2023 level and exclude veterans health and cuts, and that would leave somewhere around $500 billion, of which the Biden request this year is a net 27.5 out of non-defense. So, you've got one party wanting to go from 660 to 719, one from 660 to 500. That's a 9 to 10% real increase versus a 20 to 25% cut. How the hell do you reconcile positions that are that far apart? I'm really not sure how you can. So I would anticipate at least one government shutdown this year sometime. I'm not sure whether it would be September 30th or around a debt ceiling time, possibly several shutdowns while they figure this out and who's going to break and who's not. Going to a year-long CR, continuing resolution at the end of the year, is also a very possible outcome, which is why they were so careful assembling the FY 2023 Act, because they knew it might get CR'd once, maybe twice, and they were very careful what they were putting in versus leaving out of that one. Now we're going to go to the specifics of the U.S. DOT budget, where they've requested a total of $145 billion for the Department of Transportation. Now, the good news is 80% of that $145 billion has already been provided by the IIJA. It was like $76.6 billion in Highway Trust Fund Contract Authority and $36.8 billion in General Fund advance appropriations have already been provided. All Congress has to do is not repeal it and not limit it, and it's guaranteed. The stuff in green there is what Congress actually has to do by affirmatively passing a law this year. They've got to do $28.2 billion or so in appropriations the president wants, and $3.35 billion in new contract authority the president wants. Wait a minute. What? Just push to audience. Hold on a second here. Okay, Eric, it says push to audience. Time out, folks. It says push to audience. I can't use control anymore here.
Yeah, there you go, Jeff.
Right.
There you go.
Okay, so like I said, $145 billion, 80% of it's already given out. All Congress needs to do is pass new appropriations, about $28 billion, and the new airport contract authority. Where it would go, that $145 billion, you can see here by mode, about $70 billion for highways, $39 billion for railroad and transit, $25 billion for aviation, and $10 billion for everything else. It's multimodal grants, the safety agencies, maritime, and overhead. How it compares to past years, you can see that it was 2018 where Trump and the Democrats signed that budget deal that allowed a 40% increase in the annual appropriations, the green columns here. And then in 2022, IIJ comes along, really boosts contract authority, and puts that extra orange stuff on there for the advanced appropriations for 5 years. And we're still, roughly coasting along there. So that's it's a huge jump versus 145 versus about 78 in 2017. We've about doubled the size of the department's spending since 2017. And this is the amount of money that the IIJ has already created. You can see the advanced money. It's almost all general fund for railroads and ports and the FAA, half and half for the safety programs, and then mostly contract authority for FTA and highways. So this is what the Biden administration wants Congress to enact for FY24. $28.16 billion in new discretionary appropriations, $3.35 billion in new contract authority for the airport improvement program, and they want to increase hazmat registration fees to allow a $29 million increase for first responder hazmat grants. And the first of those is appropriations, the rest is the authorizing committees that they want this year. That $28.16 billion appropriations request, as usual, over half of it goes to the FAA. Then you have the Federal Railroad Administration, the mass transit, and everything else sucking that up. Everything else is 1.2 for mega grants, $980 million for MARAD, $348 million for essential air service subsidies, and $340 million for pipelines and hazmat. Now, in order to understand what they're doing with the discretionary budget, it's a big switcheroo. Part one is they proposed eliminating $5.4 billion in Congress's priorities. starting with the 2.6 billion in earmarks. They say kill that, and the general fund plus ups that had been happening since that Trump budget deal in 2018, where the appropriators would sort of add on top of highway, transit, and airport programs. They want to kill all that, and they also want to kill the regular appropriation for raise grants. The IIJ money would still be left intact. So it's 5.4 trillion in attacking Congress's priorities. And of course, because they are Congress's top priorities, they are not likely to go anywhere. Definitely the earmarks and the raise grants, and the rest of it probably not. Then they propose to replace some of that $5.4 billion with $4.6 billion of administration priorities. And so in lieu of $800 million for raise grants, they want to put $1.2 billion for mega project grants instead. They want a huge boost in Office of the Secretary's salaries and expenses, but their budget justification doesn't actually do the work of showing which office wants what raise, so they're not going to get that. They want an extra $75 million for thriving communities. Big increases for FAA operations, up to $1.3 billion there for FAA total. Significant raises for rail programs, and a big jump for FTA capital investment. I'll get to the specifics of those later. So to kill $5.4 billion in Congress, add back $4.6 billion in your own priorities, and you get a bill that's $807.5 million smaller on gross terms. And they propose some old highway rescissions that are harmless, and then they wind up with $882 million smaller bill in general total net, and net is what counts for these totals. So then you look at O.S.T by mode here. We'll start off, like I mentioned, they want to reprioritize mega projects over raise grants by totally shifting the regular appropriation from raise to mega. Again, there would still be $1.5 billion from IIJA for raise and $1 billion for mega, an IIJA that would arrive anyway. So that's sort of where that switch would go. And I understand where they're coming from, because the administration apparently feels that mega is much more oversubscribed than raise, and the numbers seem to bear that out. $1 billion a year doesn't go very far on mega projects. In FY22, they only were able to fund 9 mega projects out of that first $1 billion in IIJA money, and 2 or 3 of those were runts, basically the size of raise grants. And they had to promise 3 years of outfunding from future years for Hudson Yards to get under that $1 billion ceiling. And whereas raise can give out scores of 20 to 30 million projects, and dozens and dozens more of planning grants with $2.5 billion a year, and they could do a lot. They could still do quite a bit with $1.5 billion a year as opposed to 2.2. But there's sharp limits on how much mega can get. And so from a executive branch point of view, I understand that. From a congressional point of view, that's why it's not likely to go anywhere, because Congress is set up to prefer spreading money widely with many grants to many states and districts instead of a few grants to a few states and districts. And so that's just the nature of the Democratic beast, unfortunately. Going to mass transit next, because that's where most of the news is this year. Okay, first of all, budget doesn't affect any of the IIJ money. So there's $18.2 billion coming to mass transit from the IIJA, 14 in contract authority, 4.25 general fund advance. None of that changes. As I mentioned, and that shows you where the 18.2 goes. Outside of the IIJA, the budget, again, I told you, it kills the earmarks, which was $361 million last year, and goes ahead and proposes getting rid of the other $182 million of general fund plus up formula grants from last year. But what they're doing, okay, that $1.6 billion you see there in the top left of the circle for capital investment grants, that is paired with an annual appropriation for the whole total. And the annual appropriation, Congress is asking Biden is asking a $215 million increase, total of 2.85, and then you add IIJA. And what they're really doing is that, so they get 1.6 a year from IIJA for this program. What they did with the first 2 years is they prioritized paying off the ongoing projects early. The federal government had, 5 to 7 year full funding grant agreements with like 9 or 10 different projects, and the using that 1.6 a year, they've applied money to future years and gone ahead and paid them off early to save these sponsors some debt service costs. So this budget would completely pay off every full funding grant agreement that's in the pipe that's currently been signed. Clean slate. But in order to replace those, budget proposes signing 7 new ones, 6 new start, 1 core capacity, and they are some of them are gigantic ones, biggest ever in the history. So these new FFGAs would cost $2.6 billion in 2024 and $15.5 billion appropriated by Congress in 2025 and future out years. And even once you apply the remaining $3.2 billion of guaranteed IIJ money, if it went entirely towards those, you'd still have $12.3 to pay in future years. Plus $339 million for 6 bus rapid transit new starts and $167 million for the expedited project delivery pilot program. Here are the 7 new starts proposed for the budget, and you can see that they've had $727 million in allocations in past years, 2.6 this year, and then 15.5 in the future. Hudson River Tunnel, they want $5.9 billion from Uncle Sam for that, from the CIG program, $4.1 billion for BART Silicon Valley, Berryessa, $2.5 billion for Second Avenue Subway in the future. And this is, it's going to be a long time paying those off. We've never actually incurred so much theoretical, non-legally binding debt, or future funding imbalances for these programs before. The budget also proposes a few policy changes here at mass transit. They propose that the authorizing committees amend Title 49 U.S. Code to do 3 things. In response to the fiscal cliff, where the transit agencies in big cities especially are about to run out of their COVID aid and have serious balance sheet problems, they want to amend the law to allow urbanized areas of any size, not just under the 200,000 population as in current law, in FY 2024 only, to use their urbanized area apportionment funding or their flex transfers from federal highways for transit operating expenses. However, the underlying law will not change that applies to the under 200 case. So they'll have a choice to make. If they choose to spend their apportionments on capital, the federal government will pay 80 cents out of every dollar. If they choose for operating expenses, the federal government will only pay 50 cents out of every dollar. This was the deal originally struck in 1974, I believe, when they created the operating expenses in the first place. And it's for obligations in FY 2024 only. And additionally, to make things easier, for FY 2024 only, they would request an amendment to Title 49 to increase the federal matching share of the elderly disabled and rural formula grant apportionments from 80% to 100%. And on a permanent basis, they want to allow, instead of allowing just right-of-way acquisition, they want to allow much more real estate purchases along, anywhere near the right-of-way using your federal dollars. And so the top 2 of those, since they're being phrased as FY 2024 only, you wonder, the authorizing committees have to sign off on this, at least to get permission. House T&I, Senate Banking will at least have to get permission. Whether or not they want to use their own bill that they get through House and Senate, or whether they would give permission for the appropriations committees to do this, if it was a permanent change, I'd say no way. If it is a FY 2024 only change, the authorizers might be more willing to work with the appropriations committees and allow this to happen in that vehicle, if they are going to allow this at all. But you'll have to see, they have to have hearings, go before T&I and banking and ask for this, and then see what the sentiment is. I would doubt that they would do a permanent change on right-of-way acquisition in an appropriations bill, but stranger things have happened. Now going on to aviation, there are some sizable increases proposed here. They propose an $826 million increase in FAA operations, about 6.9%. A little over $500 million of that is for the scheduled pay raises and benefit increases, because the combination of the controller pay increases scheduled in the contract plus inflation being what it is. $117 million to accelerate new controller hiring. Back during COVID, we were down to only adding about 500 new trainees a year for graduating the Air Traffic Control Academy. This will take that 117 million will allow, I believe, 1,800 new controllers to graduate the academy in 2024 and settle into their 2-year probationary period. And then $16 million to meet the personnel demands caused by the certification reform law of 2020. On the capital side, they want a $517 million increase. That's 17.6%, mostly for facilities and equipment, telecom infrastructure, a little bit for personnel cost increases, and a whole new category of called just NAS modernization acceleration. They want $115 million for. They're likely to get much of the personnel increase on the operations side. The problem, and this has always been the problem, is that when both operations and capital want increases, capital programs tend to get behind because you can always, you can stretch a 5-year capital program into a 6-year capital program with much less visibility and much less agonizing than you do with asking people to wait a year for their pay raise or something like that, or lay people off. So those are the two big priorities. But remember, this is supposed to be the year that Congress addresses aviation and reauthorizes things. And we had hoped that would be in the budget, but no go. There's no reauthorization proposal yet. So all the numbers in the budget for 2024 and after are kind of placeholders. They say, quote, the department works to define and present specific proposals that respond to the changing aviation landscape. We look forward to working with all our stakeholders to bring to fruition an FAA authorization bill that is reflective of our core principles and continues to improve the safest and most efficient aerospace system in the world. As a placeholder, they are requesting another $3.35 billion of contract authority for the Airport Improvement Program, which is baked into the baseline, and the usual AIP set-asides for Office of Airports research and cooperative research. But there's no need to really try to get a increase in FY 2024 in airport grants just because we're already getting $3 billion a year from the IIJA for airport grants on top of the $3.35 from the trust fund. And there's also another $1 billion for the terminal grants and $1 billion for F&E that are coming up this year out of the IIJA anyway. And then elsewhere in the Office of the Secretary, you've got the request for $348 million of an appropriation for the Essential Air Service Subsidy, which is roughly the same as the last 2 years. And they estimate $154 million after sequestration for the mandatory side of that program. Moving on to railroads. They have a proposal to reprioritize the Amtrak national network a little farther ahead of the Northeast Corridor. They would cut appropriations for the Northeast Corridor by $33 million from last year and increase the national network by $648 million. Amtrak is going to be the first thing that House Republicans come for, so that I'm not really expecting that national network appropriation increase to happen in the House. It's always been Senate, and Senate Republicans in particular, who keep the national network going. So we'll see what happens when they get over there. But again, they're trying to reprioritize the national network ahead of the NEC. They also want to reprioritize that new intercity passenger rail service over CRISI grants. Congress is unlikely to agree to this, first of all, because the IPR, the Federal State Partnership for Interstate Passenger Rail, this huge $7.2 billion a year program started under the IIJA, has shown us bupkis so far. They weren't able to get an FY23 NOFO out. They combined it with FY24. No grants selected yet. So Congress has no idea how DOT is going to spend this money. And until they get an idea, it's much less likely that they would actually give them a significant amount more. They gave them $100 million a year so they can have the oversight and be able to call people in to testify and yell at them, but if need be. But they're not going to plug extra serious money into this until they see what kind of choices that DOT will be making with the $14.5 billion they've already got. But similarly, those are going to be very big tickets on that program. So CRISI grants, again, are very popular because you can use a lot of them for very small grants and spread them widely, and which is why Congress likes plussing up that program. And I really don't see why they would change this year. The administration, again, asks funding for two programs that were not funded in the FY23 appropriations bill. They want another $250 million for grade crossing grants to plus up the $600 million of IIJA. And they also want bill language that would allow more than 20% of a year's grants to go to projects in a single state. I'm not sure which the lucky state would be, but we'll see if that goes anywhere. And they want $50 million for rail restoration enhancement. There's no great groundswell in Congress for either one of those. At safety and operations, they want a 9% increase over FY23, but the budget request was basically put together before East Palestine. So if you read the CJs, they don't really seem like that safety and operations increase is targeted to what happened in East Palestine. And the railroad R&D budget, they want a 34% increase. The bulk of that is for this Railroad Systems Issues Research Program. And again, if you look at the fine print, that was written before the East Palestine. Oh, I can knock my camera over. There we go. It was before East Palestine. So they're talking about that Railroad System Issues Research Program talks as much about sustainable biofuels, et cetera, and electricity as it does about safety. This is a slide I put together that shows how much we're spending for the entire Federal Railroad Administration. I went back to 1977 because that's basically as far as the public database goes, and converted to 2012 dollars because that's what the OMB uses as their constant dollar in their historical tables for infrastructure and investment. So, and you can see that we've actually had this constant level of there have been two peaks before the absorbance of Conrail and the initial Northeast Corridor Improvement Program in about 1980-81, and then the Obama era stimulus FY9-10, and the two spikes followed by basically nothing. And so now we're going to have a 5-year height about that same level historically adjusted, but see where we go after that. But the table is fun because it also shows you when inflation mattered and when it didn't. Maritime. We've just had a big changeover in maritime because for 5 years they were in the process of this huge once-in-a-generation capital program to buy 5 new training vessels for the 5 state maritime academies at $300 million a pop. So 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, the Maritime Administration budget was hugely in sort of a bubble there because of that. And so the State Maritime Academy budget is now dropped down to $53 million versus $423 million 2 years ago. To replace some of that, they have a new U.S. Merchant Marine Academy capital asset management program that has taken the capital program there from $5.5 million 2 years ago to $92 million in the current request. Got to replace that last program with something. The defense programs get a $378 million request. It's $10 million less than last year because there's a new proposal for cable laying fleet, about the fiber optic cables being part of the defense budget that was in last year that the administration proposes to let lapse. And then port infrastructure grants get a $230 million request, $18 million more than last year, plus the $450 coming from IIJA. So that's a pretty good bump there. At pipelines and hazmat, they request a 14% increase for hazmat safety for increased staff and compliance and investigation cost. In the after East Palestine, that'll get much more attention than it would have otherwise. They also repeat something from last year where they requested that the authorizing committees amend the law to increase the maximum hazmat registration fee in Title 49 from $3,000 a year to $15,000 a year. That would allow a 2/3 increase in the funding for the mandatory emergency preparedness fund to train first responders for hazmat incidents like what happened in East Palestine. So that it was ignored by Congress last year, may not be ignored this time. I think there's something similar in that bipartisan Senate bill. I'm not sure. And the baseline projections also see pipeline safety fee receipts rising by $37 million. And the administration proposes to use that increase to increase the reimbursement rates for states from, I think, around 55% to 80% for pipeline safety inspections. So that's that. Highway motor carrier safety. At motor carriers, there's only one change in the IIJA. Somehow they let $60 million in contract authority go unused, and the administration wants to transfer that $36 million for IT upgrades at FMCSA and $24 million to pay for the medium-duty truck crash causation study. At NHTSA, on the highway safety side, there's no change from the IIJA stuff or those levels. On the vehicle safety side, they are proposing a 45% increase in the annual general fund appropriation for vehicle safety. The priorities would be rulemaking, enforcement, and research and analysis. And finally, the biggest mode, highways. IIJA provides $60.8 billion in Highway Trust Fund Contract Authority and the $9.5 billion general fund in advance. Budget requests the full IIJ obligation limitation. The budget requests zero extra general fund funding other than that was provided in the IIJA. So that's a $3.4 billion cut from last year. And from that, only one change from the IIJA. The budget proposes to divert $60 million of unobligated TIFIA surplus money to fund the Active Transportation Infrastructure Pilot Program, which was authorized but not funded by IIJA, and which Congress gave $45 million out of that $3.4 billion last year. They proposed to keep it going and give it $60 million unfunded with unobligated TIFIA surplus. And there's close to $2 billion in unobligated TIFIA money. And the current interest rate and scorekeeping environment has meant that it's basically impossible to spend those balances down, no matter how many projects they approve. The subsidy rates are being scored as so small that you could easily give a loan to every eligible project and still have $1.5 billion left sitting in this account clogging things up. So I suspect this will not be the first attempt you see to transfer unobligated TIFIA balances to pay for something else. And I don't know if this one will be successful, but eventually something will be successful because that money is just sitting there useless. And here's the colorful graph for how the highway money would be spent. And again, almost all of this is formula. The NHPP, STBGV, all those are formula stuff. 5.5 of that $8 billion for bridges is formula. So you've only got 8.5 billion or so out of the entire $70 billion that's not formula apportioned. I think about 90% of the IIJA contract authority and about 72% of the IIJA general fund money was through some kind of formula. And those are the modes. And the only other thing I have to point out, to keep an eye on, is that the Treasury Department and the Congressional Budget Office are much farther apart than usual on their projections of tax receipts for transportation trust funds. You can see here that over the ongoing 23 and the next 5 years, 24 to 28, CBO and Treasury are about almost $16 billion apart on highway trust fund excise tax receipts at current law rates, and about $10.7 billion apart on airport and airway trust fund tax receipts. And 15, that's well over half a year of solvency for the highway trust fund. The airport and airway doesn't have the same solvency issues right now, but that's a big, that 10.7 over 5 years is a big difference on what the uncommitted balance is going to be 5 years from now, in theory, that you could spend down in the next authorization bill if you wanted to. So that's something to keep an eye on. The OMB has a little note in their budget that said that their economic forecast was locked back in November and maybe in early November, and some things have changed since then, so they sort of apologize for it being so pessimistic. I'm not sure when CBO's locked, but that is definitely something to keep an eye on as this cycle progresses. That is the end of the basic summary presentation, and I'd be glad to take questions.
Fantastic, Jeff. It's an awful lot of info to go through, even though you didn't have to stand online at the government printing office. And folks, keep in mind, this is just a couple of days ago that this came through. So really great stuff, and not just facts and figures, as you all saw, but lots of really great insights into kind of what policy decisions are being made, strategically what the administration might be thinking about, politically what might be happening with Congress. So really great stuff all in there. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. There's already some questions that are coming in. Again, just as a reminder, use the Q&A function on the webinar website to ask questions. And I'm just going to tick through a couple of these. I'm going to try to group them into modal categories. Just seems like an easy way to do it here. And so, Jeff, so the first one is there any indication of any kind of legislative fix for the potential Federal Highway $3.5 billion accounting error / rescission? You kind of talked about this in Transportation Weekly a few weeks ago.
Yeah, basically, because the IIJA for the first time requires the administration requiring agencies to keep track of IIJ money distinct from regular money. That's never happened on the Highway Trust Fund contract authority before. So they're having to to the money that has rolled over from previous bills is now distinct in all the budget databases from the new IIJ money. And because of that, they've had to deal with an issue they've known about for some time, which is that the FHWA computers that manage grants say that there's $3.5 billion more contract authority out there held by states than the DOT-wide accounting software of record knows about. And they think this goes back to at least before 2006. They briefed Congress a few weeks ago saying that they're going to do one more audit of what happened in 2003, 4, 5 when they put this accounting system in. And if they can't find when the error happened, then the accounting system of record that gets audited every year, that is what OMB and Treasury used to put this budget together, is going to win any dispute with the FHWA grant management software. So that would result in states losing about $3.5 billion of contract authority balances from before the IIJ that they thought they had. Most of it in CMAQ, transportation alternatives, and a couple other things, that are not easy for some states to spend. So there is no solution for that at this time. We're waiting to hear back from FHWA on their forensic analysis of the 2003, 4, 5 period. But if we don't hear something by September, by this fall, then they're probably going to have to try to ask some kind of legislative solution from Congress that would be preferable to them losing money they thought they had. The time to have dealt with this would have been during IIJA when they were just, setting contract authority levels willy-nilly, but they did not do that.
Let's shift to aviation for a second. Is there anything to read into the lack of clear requests from the administration in advance of the FAA reauthorization? You touched on this a little. You said in an ideal world, this might be something that would be teed up here, but anything to read into that?
I don't know. I don't know if the waiting period for a new that is being stretched out for a new administrator running the FAA matters. They were trying to hold out to see if a new administrator would want to put their own policy imprint on it, or if the policy staff in the undersecretary's office was just still so swamped with IIJ implementation they didn't have time to deal with it yet. I don't know that.
There's probably nothing to read into necessarily. In terms of transits, so a bunch of questions coming in around the whole notion of the fiscal cliff and what the administration, what Congress could be doing. You talked about the one-time proposal to allow capital to be shifted for operating. Is there anything that you think could have been done in here for agencies that are suffering for ridership declines? There's nothing expected from Congress. Do you expect anything beyond what's been proposed here?
This is the limit of what the administration is willing to ask for right now. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing if the industry, if APTA and the MTA and the rest come to Congress and openly ask for anything else. But this was always, we discussed this last year, that this was always seen as the low-hanging fruit in lieu of a real bailout. They're not going to, you're coming to ask, let me rephrase this, asking more flexibility to allow the money you were getting from Congress anyway to be used for operating expenses is a much, much easier ask, particularly for this Congress, than asking them to appropriate extra money special on top just for operating expenses. So this is always seen as the low-hanging fruit temporary solution, and then anything a longer-term solution would have to wait until we reauthorize IIJA 2.5, 3 years from now. But at that point, we'll have a much better notion of what the new normal post-COVID telecommuting age ridership levels are. Because if you look at the forecast, like the MTA hired McKinsey or somebody to do a study, and they've updated it once or twice since then. And it's the unknowns and the high end and the low end of these things are so drastic. It's really hard to make projections based on data on things that are that uncertain.
And to your point, the fact that it's just for FY24 makes it, I think, probably more palatable for some folks. It makes it clear that this is an emergency style provision.
Yes.
Okay, so bunch of questions. Folks are wondering about then the budget ceiling standoff. What does it mean for this particular mode? What does it mean for that particular mode? Maybe just start broad. What do you think it means in general? What do you see happening with the budget ceiling standoff, and how do you think it's going to play out with all this discussion today?
I don't see how you're going to again. Congress isn't probably going to wind up passing a budget blueprint because that requires the House and Senate to get together, and that's not going to happen. But at some point, if they're going to pass appropriations bills, they've got to agree how much money is going to be in each bill. And as long as they're $720 billion versus $500 billion that far apart, that's not going to happen. So first step is to actually see if Republicans have the votes in the House to pass anything at all. Because I'm not 100% sure they do. They could, if they write bills at this total, will they have the votes to pass the House? That is an open question. If they try to pass a few and then can't, then they obviously have to regroup, and that hurts their negotiating room. But I don't think that DOT is going to be one of the first bills out the gate, and we'll see what happens there. But at the end of the day, when we saw it coming for a long time in 1995, and we saw it coming for a long time in 2011, that it was going to take a government shutdown of some kind just to let the energy out of the room and let the most eager to join in combat see how miserable these things are and have it taken out of them. So that's that's the September 30th deadline. I'm not sure what the other one is. Whenever if debt ceiling comes first or not, that depends on how good the tax receipts are in April. But they're two separate things. The September 30th, a lapse of appropriations shutdown doesn't mean the government's out of money. It means that for most agencies, there's no more legal permission to show up for work and obligate any money. It's a legal thing. What happens with debt limit is that the Treasury actually the government actually runs out of money, because remember, it's the Federal Reserve that prints money, not the Treasury Department. So they can't just do it on their own. So the way the government effectively prints money, like during COVID, is that the Fed just the Treasury sells debt and the Fed buys that debt. The Fed prints money to buy the debt, but if debt ceiling means that they can't sell debt anymore, that's how the government runs out of actual money during a debt ceiling. And we've never actually gone that far before. So when they get to prioritizing, that's going to be interesting.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that this year. It's going to be certainly something to watch. Just last few minutes here. So as always, lots of questions about Amtrak and rail. The chart showing the Amtrak, the spikes was a really eye-popping chart you had, just showing what's happened previously and what we're living through right now. Is there anything to know about the administration's interest in, as you said, reprioritizing the national network over the NEC? And then related, a couple questions about, in terms of Congress, and Republicans in the House, don't they represent a lot of the districts that would benefit from the national network? You had some comments about politically how challenging it might be to get this through. So just kind of summarize all that around the national network versus the NEC force.
Well, the NEC is the only place that has the population density to support rail service like you see in Europe and certain parts of Asia. And so that's always been the hope. If you're ever going to get it to work right at high speeds, especially that kind of intensive high-speed service, it would have to be in the Northeast. Amtrak has, it's hard to separate the nostalgia part of intercity rail from the practical sides of it. But Republicans in general don't like operating subsidies, and the national network is always going to have a huge operating subsidy. And for some reason, Republicans in the Senate are okay with that. They would rather see the Southwest Chief. Senator Moran won't let him cut the Southwest Chief. And it's about, it's been about preserving the existing service, and they're willing to pay those operating subsidies. The Republicans in the House, being a more anti-government spending type, have been unwilling to do that, even if it sometimes benefits their districts. But also, and the House being much more urban centric in general is where support for mass transit is going to come from, and where support for the Northeast Corridor is going to come from. The Senate has always been where more support for Amtrak happened. Senators have to care about members being able to, people get from one side of their state to the other. I'm also actually in the middle of doing a paper on the fact that one of the big transformative things was that because traditionally the Senate was more urban focused and the House more rural focused until the 1960s and early 70s. And so support for mass transit and rail sort of changed. And how much of that was due to one man, one vote, making districts more urban in the House versus state than they have been before. I'm trying to, do some poli-sci stuff on that. But, back to the subject, a lot of Republicans just have a big chip on their shoulder about operating subsidies. They don't think the federal government's business to be subsidizing them, period. And there have never been enough of them to be a 218 vote majority to kill things like essential air service subsidies and Amtrak. But there's enough of them to stop it from happening in the Republican conference. The guy who used to run the aviation accounts of the House Appropriations Committee, who said, look, if you want deficit reduction, I can find you $1 billion in this bill that is far easier than screwing with the $150 million essential air service subsidy appropriation. Just that you want to take those 100 rural airports out of the system. It's just not worth it politically to fight that. And we'll see how these guys go on transit operating subsidies and Amtrak operating subsidies, out, in the national network later this year.
And that just shows my poor moderating skills, leaving 1 minute for you to talk about politics of Amtrak, EAS. Certainly something we can't do right here. But I want to thank you all very much for your participation. Jeff, thank you so much for this great overview. As I said, lots of great data, lots of great statistics, but tremendous insights that you won't get anywhere else. So if you would like more information about ENO, you can check out our website at www.enotrans.org. And if you didn't already know the value of ENO Transportation Weekly, you certainly know it now. ETW and Jeff Davis is a really invaluable resource for all aspects of transportation policy and practice. So I encourage you to check that out. So once again, Jeff, thank you so much for all of this. And to you all, thank you so much for joining and have a great day, everybody.
No problem. Thank you.